Today I'm going to answer a common question or talk about a topic that's really common as you're coming up to or just retiring, which is, do you need to sell assets around retirement? And how to think about the timing, what impact a tax is going to have, and should you be getting money into super? This is going to be part one of 3 podcasts, and I'm going to take you through a bunch of case studies and examples over those 3 podcasts and one today. I'm broadcasting this from the banks of the Yuan River in Tassie. We're meandering Tassie with some friends at the moment and quite enjoying it, although for November it's pretty cold. So let's get into it. Firstly, disclaimer, I don't know your circumstances. I'm going to talk about lots of things that I hope are helpful, but you should get advice or do your own research before making any decisions. So let's, as always, get a bit of context. Where does this fit in terms of our 5 essential steps, which is our real planning that we talk about. So this is about the strategy that you're going to need to generate retirement income. So we've done a stock take, we've got our clear picture of our world, we've worked out our goals, and then we can start to think about strategy. Our core belief is always we think the best financial decisions are made as part of a real plan, which has these 5 simple steps. And it's exactly the same as if you're going on holiday like I am at the moment. So we've got a stock take. Where am I? Today I'm sitting here in the Yuan Valley. We're heading off to a place called Tarrally later on. I hopefully haven't butchered that for anyone from Tassie. And we'll leave at a certain time. And we know that we've picked out the path we're going to take. And they're the strategies and tactics. Where will you stop for lunch? And we just always think that analogy is really good, that the best decisions are made as part of a plan. And right for this topic, should we sell some assets? How should we sell them? How should we think about selling them? It's in the strategy section of that. So let's have a look at some of the reasons that people sell assets around about retirement. And around about retirement, I'm talking the 5-ish years leading up to retirement or the years after retirement. And there's no importance of the timing except as it affects a lot of things I'm going to talk about. One of the reasons, and I've talked about this in other episodes, is to pay off debt. So most people don't want to retire and still have debt, although you can plan to have some debt if your cash flow allows for it and if it kind of works. But most people prefer to pay down debt. So number 1 reason, to pay off debt. Number 2 reason, and these aren't in any particular order, but to get more into super. Super is such a good structure for holding assets in retirement. Remember, super is not an investment, it's a structure. So to be able to get more money in means you're getting more tax-free earnings and tax-free growth on your investments. So super is the single best structure to hold investments in retirement. So number 3, sometimes you'll have an asset that you just don't think is going to be okay for retirement. You might have had an asset that was growing well. I mean, even a business is a good example of that, but it might have been a commercial property that you just think might be a bit more trouble than it's worth. It could be anything, that you just don't think is going to be okay for retirement. As you switch particularly from chasing growth to chasing income, and you don't need to chase income specifically because what you're chasing is cash flow to live off, which we'll talk about. But there's some assets that you just might say, look, I don't think I want to keep that in retirement. That may correspond with number 4, isn't it? Sometimes you're just sick of an asset. Think property, you might just be done with a particular property you've had, or the whole concept of owning property and being a landlord. And I'll talk about some of the issues there. But let me take the simplest of examples. And someone in Sydney that might have a $2 million investment property, debt-free, think, wow, house plus $2 million, that's enough for a good retirement. But if all they've got is that property, in this exaggerated example, maybe they've got rent of $1,000 a week, after costs, if they're lucky, it's $50,000 a year. Now, to be asset rich and to be trying to live off $50,000 a year seems to be crazy. You'll never get an age pension. You'll be on $50,000 a year. That's not going to be much of a retirement. That same $2 million sold, progressively put into portfolios, particularly in super, can easily generate $100,000 to $120,000, and last a lifetime. Now, it will run down. It may not be as valuable for your legacy when you leave money to your kids, grandkids, etc. But transforming that asset absolutely transforms how you're going to get your cash flow. So while property is an awesome asset, it tends to be low on income, good on capital growth, and while that's great for your kids, not necessarily great for your retirement, unless, of course, you've got enough. So someone's got 2, 3, 4 properties, and if the net income from those properties after all the costs, including taxes, is enough, happy days. They've won the retirement lottery. They can keep those properties unless they're just sick of it. And I've found everyone get sick of properties eventually. Actually, it's not everyone, but most people get sick of properties eventually because we've all had those stories from hell. And another reason to sell an asset is just downgrading or right-sizing a home. People sell their homes for all sorts of reasons in retirement. Sometimes it's just too big. Sometimes they want to free up capital. Sometimes they want to live somewhere else. But that's one of the reasons that people sell assets. So they're the reasons, and including, as I said before, the last one here is to target more income and less growth. So we've spent our working years trying to build assets where growth is critical, but in retirement we're going to need cash flow. So we're going to have to have a cash flow plan, and that often means more income. So the key areas we're going to consider whenever we're going to restructure any asset is, where's the market at? Are we in a boom? Have we just had a bust? Are we in a normal sort of situation? What do the valuations look like on our properties? What are interest rates doing? Particularly if we've got debt, what's our risk of delaying? Might assets go down in value? Conversely, might they go up in value? So this is all the timing stuff. Now, the obvious point here is we never know exactly what's going to happen with the market timing. We can guess, we can get a sense of what season we're in effectively in the market. Are we running hot? Is it cold? We just had an outside period. Yeah, and a period that's not normal. There's all sorts of things, but no one, not me, not anyone can ever tell you exactly what's happening in the market, but you can get a sense of where we're at, and you can certainly tell if the market's had a run. I'll talk about this when we go through our case study. Now, there's a cost to selling and changing over assets. Often we get people that want to change an investment property and they're selling one and buying another, not necessarily in retirement, but you go, just be careful because you're going to tear up costs. When you sell, you've got sales costs, you've got to pay an agent, you've got capital gains tax, assuming you made a capital gain, and then you've got the purchasing costs for the new asset, which includes stamp duty and other costs. So sometimes you can easily tear up $100,000 in moving from one property to another. So you've got to make sure that it is worthwhile and look at whether you can keep capital gains tax down. So are there ways to get that down, which often there is. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Super rules, no point, well, not always wise to, we've got limits on how to get money into super. I'm going to talk about some of those. So we want to coincide us selling other assets with our cash to be able to maximise what goes into the super limits, and just be aware of it, particularly as the rules around the limits of getting money in are age related as well. Liquidity issues. So, how easy is it to sell an asset? What is our cash flow going to be like? Properties, illiquid assets, sometimes they can take 6 minutes to sell. Sometimes they can take 6 months to sell. Shares, on the other hand, are completely liquid. You can sell them in a heartbeat, but then we're back to number one there, which is the timing. So, and for some people, is there a Centrelink advantage in selling assets, not selling assets? For many people, Centrelink won't be a thing. If you've built enough assets and you've got assets outside of your house of more than $1 million, you're not going to get much Centrelink unless you spend that down. For people that have got more than $2 million, you're almost never going to even attempt to get Centrelink, and that's not a bad thing. But for those that might have some chance of getting Centrelink, and one of the case studies in particular, we're going to talk about this. So our leader framework, once again, which is just to go through a process that allows us to do this with logic, unemotionally, which is to list all the key things about our asset that we're selling. What do we pay for it? What might the capital gains tax be? Yeah, all the costs of selling, all the reasons that it might be worthwhile to keep it, all the reasons it might be worthwhile to sell it. But to get that list out, evaluate that compared to the alternatives, analyse where we do the number crunching. Sometimes in that section you may need some help from an accountant, from a financial advisor if it's complicated. And then once you've got all the information, so those first three steps give us a whole bunch of information, then we can decide and then we can schedule our action and the timing of it and make sure we execute to make the same. So simple framework. So let's talk through an example, and I love a good case study. And all the case studies I would talk about are based on people I've seen, not necessarily exactly. Sometimes they're a mix, but this one is particular, reflecting someone that we worked with in a private wealth management business. So this is a couple from Sydney, 58 years old, looking to retire at 62. They went hard a few years ago and bought 3 investment properties, trying to boost their retirement savings before they retired. So they've got a total of $3 million, 2.95 of investment properties. They've got a suburban Melbourne property valued at $800,000. They've got a property in Brisbane valued at $950,000 and one on the Sunshine Coast at $1.2. But they've got some debt as they acquired these over the last decade. They've got $1.55 million of debt. So the most recent one they bought in Melbourne, I bought it for just under $600,000. It hasn't risen as much as some of the others, but it's worth about $800,000. So still got $600,000 debt. And I've simplified some of the numbers here. The Brisbane one, $350,000 debt, and a loan for $350,000 in the Sunny Coast property, $600,000 of debt, and $600,000 they paid with. Now, out of their properties, from their goals point of view, they'd like to keep the Sunshine Coast one. They don't know whether they'll ever move there. They don't know whether they'll stay there much, but they might. So they want to keep a footprint up there. They think they could keep one out of here, and that's in their goals. Now, what I'm doing here is listing. This is a stock take pit where we're listing everything about it. We're trying to avoid making decisions early and jumping to the tactics. There's a real tendency to people go, should I hold that property in Melbourne? What do you think? And I go, well, the best decisions are made as part of a plan, a real plan. So where we've got a nice clear picture of their world. And that's what we're doing here. We're getting that clear picture so we can get context so we can make a good decision. So, yeah, that's their goal. They know they're going to have to sell because the properties are still costing money, and they want to enjoy a good retirement. They've got super balances of $800,000 and $200,000. They've got a nice home worth $3 million. They've got no mortgage. Somewhere down the track, they'll downsize that to something around $2 million. They're not in a hurry to do that. They're earning $240,000, $75,000 right now. So decent income earners. They want to be debt-free in retirement, so they don't want to have debt in retirement. And they want about $150,000 to $180,000 per annum in retirement. Now you can work out the assets you'll need from our how much workshop and the calculator. Look online for that sort of information. But I'm going to say for them, they're going to need portfolio and property equity of somewhere around about the $3 million mark, depending on their legacy. Might be a bit less, might be a bit more, depending on their risk profile, how they're going to invest in the legacy. But let's say they need $3 million. I'm going to do a quick calculation of their equity here. There's $1.4 million of equity in their investment properties. I just took 2.95, the total value, minus 1.55. In this first cut, I'm not taking account of taxes. That will, of course, come off it. But let's say 1.4 million, super of $1 million, so they're up to 2.4, and which doesn't sound like enough, but knowing they're going to free up $1 million from selling their home at some stage, I go, yep, they're in the right ballpark. So they should be comfortably able to, if managed well, and that's a big if, generate that income of $150,000 to $180,000 and be debt free. They got 3 adult kids, one still at home, hence they're not wanting to move in a hurry, but that's their situation. So let's get some context around a few things. And firstly, we talked about one of the reasons to do this is how to get money into super. So for this couple, keep in mind they're a 55-year-old couple, I'm having a look at the ways they can get money into super. Firstly, we've got super contributions that you get a tax deduction for putting in. They call these concessional contributions these days. They used to be called deductible. but they like to mess with these things, so they changed it to concessional. There's a limit of 30,000 per annum for everyone that you can put in, and this includes your employer contributions and any personal salary sacrifices or personal contributions you make that you claim a deduction. So you put the 30,000 in, you get a tax deduction off your own income. You pay 15% on the way in. If you're earning more than 250,000, which these guys are not technically, but they might be. One of them earns 240, and depending on how the property income stacks up, that might push them over. So it's something we'd take into account, but let's just assume they're not at this stage. So 15% is better than, in one case here, we've got income earner at 240,000. They're paying tax at the top marginal tax rates. We'll have a look at that in a minute. So they'd lose almost half of that income if they don't put into super. Putting into super only at 15%, so a good saving. Now, with the concessionals, you may have heard people talk about, you can catch up any shortfalls from the last 5 years. So if you haven't put in the maximum over the last 5 years, assuming your balance is less than 500,000, and there's a few other conditions, you can catch up. So if someone had put just their employer contributions in for the last few years, and it averaged, say, half of this amount, then they can catch up the other half over 5 years. Now, this can be really, really useful for managing capital gains, which we're going to touch on for this couple. So if you save them up, so to speak, and then you sell a property, instead of having all of that taxable, you can claim a tax deduction against it and pay a lot less in taxes when you sell your property. But the thing here is you've got to have a balance less than 500,000. So we've got a couple here. One of them is over 500,000. One of them is under. Now, we've seen cases where sometimes it's worthwhile manipulating that. So in this case, someone might wait till they're 60, pull literally some money out of super to get under 500,000. Have waited 5 years of not putting much into super, so then you could potentially catch up 5 years at 30,000 going forward if you're planning. So 150,000 for each member of a couple, so that's 300,000 in deductions, and that would eliminate 600,000 of capital gains. Now you've got to plan that really carefully. That's an extreme event, and you've then got to work out how to get money back into super, by the way. But you've got until age 75 to get money into super. So in the case of concessionals, up to age 75, up to age 67, anyone can put them in. Between 67 and 75, you've got to meet a work test, which is 40 hours of work in any 30-day period. So some people will be able to manage that, others won't, but they're the rules. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. Non-concessional contributions is the other type, and these are contributions that we put money into super, but we don't claim a tax deduction, nor do we have any money taken out. So when you put concessionals in, you get a tax deduction, but your superannuation balance pays 15% of tax. When you put in a non-concessional contribution, you get no tax deduction, but nor does any money come out of your super, and it stays in the tax-free camp in your super. There's a limit of 120,000 per year on non-concessionals. You can bring forward 2 years' worth, so you can do 360,000 in one hit. That means you then couldn't do any for the next 2 years, and then every 3 years you could effectively do 360, or you can do 120,000 a year. Now, the age limit for this is up to age 75. There is no work test on this anymore. They made some rule changes a couple of years ago where they got rid of the work test on non-concessionals, but they kept it for concessionals. It's one of these silly things that makes super complicated because they keep messing with rules but not necessarily cleaning it up. So, and the last type that I want to consider for these people is downsizer contributions. So downsizer contributions are contributions you make when you sell your house. You can put in up to 300,000 each, as long as you've held your home for more than 10 years. And it's a home that will give you the principal place of residence tax exemption, which for most people is straightforward. So 10 years, and you've got to be old enough to claim that over 55, and then you can get 300,000 each into super. So that can be a big help when someone's selling some assets, because all of a sudden that's 300,000 each, 600,000. Then you bring forward 2 years worth each. Those two lots are 360, 720. So all of a sudden you can get about $1.3 million into super in one hit, which can help set you up. So let's put that into context about. Let's talk about timing as well. So this is a chart I use regularly with my clients and in some of our communications. It comes from our friends at Performance Property, who are buyers advocates that we use for some of our clients, and they make through all the research that they do, they create this visual representation of a property clock. So a property clock is just where is your particular property and your particular suburb in the cycle at the moment. And there's a repetitive cycle. Now, these cycles aren't even in time. Sometimes it can be a quick cycle. Sometimes it can be a very long cycle. But properties go through a process where they're incredibly valuable. They start to go up. Then they peak in value. There's a bit of downside potentially. Sometimes they'll go down or stay down for a long period of time. Call that stagnation. Then they become valuable again. For most people listening to this who are in their 50s, you've seen this cycle play out over your working years and reflection of the properties you own. For some, the cycle is real. Some areas the cycle is really dramatic. For other areas, it's more of a steady pace. And you can see, and it's November 2025 as I record this. So you can see the complete opposite. You've got Melbourne down the bottom right there, which has been through a period of stagnation, and it's just starting to look like it's valuable, but it's not racing away yet. Now, in theory, at some point, and here's the thing, you don't know whether that's 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. At some point, it will go up in value and start going up quickly. We've seen that with places like Brisbane over the last 5 years, where it went through a really rapid period of growth. That's that buy momentum. And in the estimate of Performance Property, it's now getting into that whole status where it's potentially moving towards a peak. Now, this is not a precise science. No one, not us, not Performance Property, not anyone, can know exactly the timing around this, but you do get a sense. It's a bit like, as I mentioned earlier, it's a bit like seasons. It's a bit like, is it summer, is it winter? And people talk about what's happened to the property market in Australia, but we're talking about what's happening in your area. You can see there's places all around this clock, so completely different. So, if your kids were looking to buy a property, it's about to go up in value at the moment. Based on this, they might look at some of those places just in that buy value area, and then depending on whether they're looking for more blue chip properties, which is the blue colour, or growth properties that might grow quickly to help pay off their mortgage. I'm not going to dive into and turn this into a whole discussion around property, but my point here is if you're selling an asset, whether it's shares, whether it's property, you need to have the context of where you are in the cycle. And for these guys, we're talking about 3 properties in 3 different places. They've got one in Melbourne, one in the Sunshine Coast, and one in Brisbane. So that might be a case of saying, well, look, you'd be mad to sell the Melbourne one right now. It's had this long period of not doing much. Maybe we hold that for 3 or 4 years expecting to get growth. And for the property in Brisbane, you might say, well, if you're going to sell one first, maybe that's the one you'd look at because it's had a good period of growth. And that won't be the only thing, but it's one of the things we're considering. So one of the other things we're considering is tax. And it's very important to understand the nature of our tax system in Australia, which is a progressive tax system. So as you earn more income, the rate at which your income above each level goes up. So if someone earns between 0 and 18,000, they don't pay any tax at all. Now that's useful to remember as you go into retirement, because if you're going to have most of your assets into super, which most people will have, there's no tax on that superannuation asset. So you might still hold a property outside of super, and let's say it's going to generate 30,000 of rent after expenses, split between a couple, 15,000 each. There's no tax to pay. Now, you will pay capital gains tax eventually, or your estate will, but there's no tax. So you can hold enough assets in retirement outside of super and still not pay any income tax if it falls under those thresholds. Once you get to 18,000 and then up to 45,000, you're paying 16 cents in the dollar. Now, I should note Medicare levy, when it kicks in, is an extra 2 cents. I call that 18 cents in the dollar, up to 45,000, and then so on and so forth. You'll see the rates jump from 16%, 30%, 37%, 45%. So add Medicare levy, so that makes the top tax rate of 47. So that means, why is this important for asset restructuring? If you're selling an asset while you're working, in this case, one of this couple earns $240,000. So they're clearly in the top tax bracket. So any extra income that goes into their taxable income is going to be taxed at 47%. Now, fast forward to when they retire, and if they're not earning any income at that point, or they're only earning income from super, which is tax-free, there's a vastly different tax rate. You can see that on the first 190,000, there's 51,000 of tax. So if you're starting at that point, everything's taxed at 47%, 45%. So 100,000 would be taxed at 45. So that's 45,000, and 190,000 would be taxed at almost 95 instead of 51. So massive difference by delaying if you can and if it makes sense. Doesn't make sense if the share or a property market was about to crash, because the quickest way to pay less tax is to watch the value of your asset go down, but that's not very smart, because obviously we only pay tax for capital gains. The worst case tax we're paying is half of the 45 cents, because just on the basics there again, if you make a $1 million gain on a property, you get, if you've held it for more than 12 months, you get the general 50% discount, which brings your taxable capital gain down to 500,000. Then it's added to your income. And if it's a big gain like that, it'll go straight to the top tax bracket pretty quickly. So let's go back to this couple and let's talk through some of the options that they've kind of got. So they're 50, 58, they plan to retire in 4 years. They've got plenty of time to get money into super. So let's assume they're going to keep the Sunshine Coast property, but they want to pay off debt. Their total debt is around 1.5 million. Their equity in the other property, the Melbourne property and the Brisbane property combined, is about 800,000. So it's not quite enough. So a valid strategy for them might be to hold these properties for another 4 years, particularly the Melbourne property. We looked at the property clock, and it might get some more growth, might build some equity. The Brisbane property still might grow a lot. There's plenty of people that are saying Brisbane's still got a long way to go, but it is starting to get peaky, so you might not expect the growth you've had at the moment. Now, right now, there's no urgency. So if they're going to work for another 4 years, particularly one of them earns $240,000 a year. So the tax deductions from holding the properties are quite valuable. But we might start to think about, down the track, how we sell them. And maybe they have a plan to sell the Brisbane one in 4 years, or 4 to 5 years after they've retired, and the Melbourne one after it's gone up a lot. Now, because they've got enough super to get started in retirement, they can take their time. And let me give you an example. And we've seen this play out time and time again with our clients. If that Melbourne property gets to a point where it's covering itself, the best time to sell it is going to be at the top of the next boom. Now, you don't know exactly where it's the top, but it's a point where markets are crazy. So I always talk about the 3 best times to sell property. One is never, if you can accumulate enough properties and you don't mind holding them. And there's no gremlins with those properties in terms of construction, etc., and maintenance costs. Holding it forever is awesome if you can do it. But for most people, that doesn't work. It's not going to work for these people necessarily. And they also want to sell. So the next best time is after you've retired, particularly if you can do it after you've retired during a crazy boom. So if you can sell at the next crazy boom, now sometimes that might be 3 years away, sometimes that might be 20 years away. So that might not work for some people. But when we look at that property clock and we see Melbourne is the only state that hasn't gone up at the time of recording since COVID. Everything else went up dramatically. Melbourne, for reasons of its own, stayed down, but it's now starting to look like value. So it's going to make sense to delay that until it's in its boom. So you could say, well, let's wait till that 800,000 goes to 1.4 million. Maybe that's 5 years, maybe that's 10 years, maybe it's longer, but you could wait. But you could look to sell the Brisbane property in 4 to 5 years' time. Now, at that point, they'll realise a capital gain. And let's say the Brisbane property goes up to, let's call it 1.1 in the next 5 years. So they paid 350, they're going to have a gain of about 750,000. They split that. Firstly, they take the 50% discount, so 750 goes to 375. Then they split that, so they got 175,000 taxable capital gain each. Now, if they can both get their supers under 500,000, and maybe only one of them can here, maybe they both can, and if they can save up some of those concessional contribution to carry forward, there's up to 150,000 each of deductions where they would only be paying 15% of tax instead of the full marginal tax rate. So there's some big tax savings to get that right. So, and they might, if they manage that carefully, be able to, instead of having 175,000 taxable, they might get that down to just 100,000, which is a game changer. They'll still be paying tax, but a lot less. Now, this is where you need to do your numbers really carefully or get good advice from your accountant to make sure you're maximising not only the capital gains tax calculation to make sure you've taken into account of all the improvements you've done to the properties, but that all the costs got added into the cost base. So when you buy a property, those stamp duty costs and everything get added onto the cost base. So a good accountant will do that routinely to make sure you pay the minimum. So there's a bit of strategy that might start to come into play around the investment properties there. And the Sunshine Coast one, they could keep and pay down the debt on that as they hit retirement. No need to pay it down earlier. Now, the downsizer, their home, and when they downsize, once again, depends on, think about where they are. They're in Sydney. Where might they be downsizing to? If they're moving just within Sydney, then it's probably not going to matter where they're moving to. It's probably going to be in the same market. So it's not going to matter whether the market's booming or not. But because they're downsizing, there's a benefit to waiting if the market's going up. So as an example, if they waited until the whole Sydney market doubled, whether that was 5 years, 10 years or 20 years, so 3 million goes to 6 million, you'd then assume the house they're going into has gone from 2 million to 4 million, so they're freeing up 2 million instead of 1 million. Now, inflation would eat some of that up, but not all of it, so they'd have more money, but they wouldn't have had that money, that downsizer money working in retirement. So their timing around that is also going to be lifestyle driven. We said they've got one adult child still at home, so they might do it quicker if they want to boot him out, or they might take longer. I knew someone that worked with me. His parents sold their house, said they were going around Australia, gifted him some money for 1 year's rent, and that was it. He was out of the family home in his early 20s. Now, not so unusual, but it was an interesting tactic from the parents. So, yeah, there's some examples there about how having a process and thinking through can save you lots of money, but can also make you money. We talked about saving money on tax, but this client that is based on, they came to me about 7 years ago. Their properties were not exactly like this, but by delaying selling, they've actually rode the boom, particularly in Brisbane, and all of a sudden their retirement just looks amazing. So properties effectively doubled in the last 7 years in Brisbane. So all of a sudden, massive equity. They're able to sell to keep one, plus the superannuation they've got, and retirement is looking pretty easy. And that's what it kind of looks like for this couple. If they can squeeze a bit more out of the property, so keep the tax breaks while working, sell at a good time, minimise tax through super contributions, and then down the track when they sell their house and they've got $1 million, if they're under age 75, downsize of 300,000 each plus the non-concessionals, bring forward of 360 each. They'll be able to get that money into super. So all of a sudden they're probably looking at $3 to $4 million in super. That's going to generate the 180,000 they would love tax-free for life if managed well. Now there's some big ifs in that. It's easy to blow money up if it's not managed well. So tune in, watch all the stuff that we do. It's all about avoiding the big mistakes and making smart decisions. So let's wrap up today's episode. In the next couple of episodes, I'm going to go through some more examples that take other things into account. For instance, Centrelink, but other things as well. So just in summing up today's, asset restructures are often part of retirement planning. So getting that understanding and good planning and timing can make a big difference, just to your confidence, but also to your dollars. It's possible here to see differences of $500,000 or more based on just executing this part of the plan really well. And that's money that will help you for the rest of your life. Yeah, differences around taxes, difference around super contributions, all that affects your cash flow. And ideally, do your numbers. If you're not confident, get help, get advice. You can tune into forums like this, but you may need to go and see an advisor. If you think you need an advisor, feel free to tap into our website and our Find Me an Advisor, where we introduce you to advisors that share our beliefs, philosophies, and service standards, which helps you in the big old world where it's hard to find an advisor that you can trust. That's it for this session. Until next time, Rob McGregor signing out.